Welcome to the Encore Audio Archives YouTube channel. I'm Taper Dave, and this is my channel. I've uploaded hundreds of talks here that I've recorded at meetings in West LA, and I've also recorded conventions starting in 2013. I've got a bunch of those up. And Walt and Mary Murray, the original owners of Encore Audio Archives, started the company in the 80s, and Walt recorded Joe and Charlie's and a bunch of stuff down in Vista, California. My sobriety date is June 20th of 1994. I hope you find something you like, so please like and subscribe to my channel and comment down below. If you want to hear something that I don't have or that you don't see, I'll see that I get it. Anyways, take care and have a great day if you want to.
My name is Geoff Callan. I'm alcoholic. Hi, Geoff. And I was rock solid until about we started reading the traditions. Some went sideways. The first thing I got to do, I do some housekeeping. I want to thank you, Shirley, for inviting us down here and taking such good care of us. And the gift basket in the room and this weekend has just been remarkable. And I thank you from the bottom of my heart for honoring me this way. And I want to thank Michaeline, who I didn't even get to hear her pitch. I got here late on Friday, and I bought your CD, and I can't wait to listen to it on the way home. But you made me comfortable here, and you made me feel good about doing this whole thing, and I appreciate it. And Matthew just knocked my socks off last night, and I wish he were here right now because he's a part of my story. And it's always an honor and a pleasure for me to be in a room with Johnny Harris. I love Johnny Harris, not just for what he stands for and what he talks about, but because Johnny always talks about Norm Alpe, and Norm was my hero. And I remember seeing Norm in these rooms in 1978 at the Riviera Hotel, and he was quite a guy, and an important part of AA history. And I don't usually tear up this soon, but and it's been great. You know, my sponsor called me a couple of weeks ago, and he said, "Hey, Jim tells me that you're speaking at the powwow." And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "What day?" And I said, "Sunday." And he said, "Isn't that usually where they have the spiritual speaker?" And I said, "I guess so." And he was quiet for a second, then he said, "Who thought that was a good idea?" So but I'm gonna clean it up, and I'm gonna do my best. It's been great being here. You know, there's a time in every convention when I get to one of these things, and sometimes it comes right away and sometimes it comes later, but there's a moment where I kick in and I surrender to this thing and I become a part of it. And I remember, you know, going to State Line, the first year they had State Line, and for me that moment then was when Angie D got up, and she was there to talk about step 3, but she was just sort of introducing herself, and I looked at her and I looked at Sandy Beach sitting there, and I started to cry, because I couldn't believe I was there. I couldn't believe I was alive and that I was in this place with these people. And that's how I feel today. And I felt that yesterday. I went to the Al-Anon luncheon. I'm sitting there trying to figure out why I'm in the Al-Anon luncheon, and they started reading the steps, and I started to tear up. I'm a bigger blubberpuss than Matthew, by the way. I want you to think that I'm tough and that I'm bad, but I'll probably cry more than Matthew. It's just the way it goes with me, and I don't mean it to be that way. I had to speak at the biker meeting at Dave's convention a couple years ago, and that was a trial. But anyway, I've been walking around, and people have been saying, "Wow, that's a really unusual way to spell your name." And last night, my wife Laura said, "Hey, dipstick, it says Geoff on your thing." So my name tag was misspelled. No wonder I didn't. Anyway, I don't know what that's got to do with anything. You know, I always start the same way. I used to be one of those guys in AA who said that the laughter kept me in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I think for me, in the early days, that was true. It did. Because I hadn't had anything to laugh about for a really long time. And here we laughed about the things that used to break our hearts. But the more I'm around and the more involved I become, it's not so much about the laughter anymore. For now, it's the stories that keep me here. It's those stories about that, and everyone in this room has one. It's that story about when the desperation in me reaches out to the God in you. And I put my hand, look, I'm doing it already, honey. And I put one hand in God's hand and one hand in your hand, and that life is forever changed. And those are the things that keep me coming back here. And I always start by telling one. I used to tell one about Jack Brennan. I've had this one I've been telling for the last few years, and I've been wanting to retire it, but I'm going to tell it one last time, and then I got to get a new story for it. But I went to a meeting one night in a guy's living room, and it was a little tiny meeting, and he lived in a condo, and so everybody's kind of cracked in there like sardines. There's about 12, 13 people in this room, and there's a woman there that night who I have never seen since, and I'd never seen her before, but she told the most remarkable story. And I want to tell it to you real quick. This was a woman who was living in New York City in Manhattan, and she was a young, upperly mobile woman, had a nice job, had a boyfriend who had a super bitchin' job, and they lived a really good life, and they went to parties, and they went to clubs, and they drank, and they used, and they had a good time. And one day she woke up, and she looked in the mirror, and she didn't like the person that she saw. And she didn't like the things she was doing, and she didn't like the way she felt, and she went to the boyfriend, and she said, I don't think I can live like this anymore. I don't know who I'm becoming, and this thing feels like it's getting out of control. And they talked it over, and so they decided they would get married and buy a place, and then everything was going to be okay. And she and Mr. Upperly Mobile bought a place, and they got married, and it got worse. And it went on like that for a while until the day woke up, and she looked in the mirror, and she saw somebody that she couldn't stand to be anymore. And she went back to the husband, and she said, I don't think I can do this anymore, because I don't like the way that I look, I don't like the way that I feel, and I don't like the things that we're doing. And I don't like the way it's taken over our life. And so they talked it over one more time, and they decided if they had a baby, then everything was going to be okay. Because she wouldn't drink or use because she was pregnant, and he wouldn't drink or use because she wasn't drinking or using, and everything was going to be like it was. And of course, the day came when she was 4 months pregnant, and she was holding on to that guy's leg, and she was begging him not to leave her. Because she said, if you leave me, I will drink myself unconscious one more time, because no matter how bad I want to stop, I want to be a good wife, and I want to be a good woman, and I want to be a good mother, and I don't want to kill this baby. I want this baby so bad, but I can't stop, because she had alcoholism. And he stepped over her that night, and he slammed the door, and he left, and she drank herself unconscious one more time, and woke up the next day on the floor. And somebody had left her a directory for Alcoholics Anonymous. And that night, she pulled herself together, and she got dressed, and she went out into the night in New York City to find Alcoholics Anonymous. And there was an address on her thing, and she went to this place, and there was a church with a little crappy sign outside, and she went down the stairs into the basement of this church. And there in this basement were about 25, 30 men sitting in a circle. It was a men's stag. And she didn't know she wasn't supposed to be there. And she didn't know anything about a men's stag, and she didn't know anything about the protocols or the rules of Alcoholics Anonymous, and she sat in the circle, and nobody knew what to do. So the leader picked up the book, and they read the open, and they said, who wants to go first? And she didn't know that she wasn't supposed to share, and she didn't know that she was supposed to raise her hand, and she poured her heart out in that room. And when she finally got that story out and poured out her whole heart and stopped sobbing, one of those guys stood up and said, gentlemen, this is the reason we're here. And nobody tried to sell her anything, and nobody tried to date her, and nobody told her any crap about their lousy day or their divorce. They talked that night about God. They talked about the steps. They talked about the book. They talked about the fellowship of the Spirit, and they told her about the miracles that they'd seen in Alcoholics Anonymous. And 16 years later, everywhere that Monica goes, people know that they don't have to die of alcoholism, because those guys gave her the truth. All they wanted for her that night was the highest good, and they gave it to her, and she's given it away to this day. That's Alcoholics Anonymous. It's not always the one that I represent. It's not always the one that I find, but it's the one that I love. It's the one that saved my life. It's the one that saved the life of the people that I love. It's changed the lives of people everywhere I go. And I got to tell that story because I got to remember what this thing is really all about. You know, and I didn't always feel that way about AA. I went to my first Alcoholics Anonymous meeting in 1968. I was in a place called Wayside Maximum. And I was 18 years old. And even though I was 18, I already knew about the morning drink, and I knew about pitiful and incomprehensible demoralization, and I knew about fear, and I knew about warrants, and I knew about evictions, and I knew about all that stuff. And I wasn't raised that way. I grew up in an upper middle class home, and I had everything a kid could ever want, but somehow I'm the guy, and I caught the genetic bullet, and I'm in the county jail waiting to go to court on a drug beef. And I just wanted to get off the unit that night, and I went to that first AA meeting, and I don't remember anything about it except for there was like 3 old grapes in the front and a couple of drag queens in the back, and I was in the middle, and I looked around that room, and I thought there was nothing here for me in Alcoholics Anonymous, and I left, and I went back out there for 10 more years. And I was 19 years old in a place called the DVI, and I was 24 in a place called Camarillo State Hospital, and I met my first wife there, and it's an excellent place to shop for a spouse, and at least it was in those days. It's a shame they closed it down. And in those years I went to all the places that I never wanted to go, and I kind of jump ahead a little bit. But in 1978, I walked back into the Radford Clubhouse in North Hollywood. Not because I thought that you guys had anything that I could ever glom onto. You know, for me, I walked in that room, and for me, walking to a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous was like walking into church. Everybody in that place, have you ever been, I've been in those churches where they have, everybody's born again, and the pastor points to somebody, and they'll go like this, and I look around AA, and you guys are all feeling something that I'm never going to feel. And you're all having an experience that I'm never going to have, and you're all plugged into something I'm never going to plug into. I'm never, ever going to feel like you or have what you have. And I walked in that place, and I looked around that room, and I started to walk out, and there was a guy there named Bob Kay. And Bob was a very controversial individual. He had all his teeth kicked out in the penitentiary, I'm sure for good reason. And he couldn't even pronounce Alcoholics Anonymous. It came out like Suffering Succotash. And they'd 86'd him from the old Radford Clubhouse because he knocked a newcomer unconscious with one punch one time because he wasn't taking direction, I guess. And that guy walked up to me, and he never, ever said anything in a quiet voice, but he walked up to me that day, and in the quietest voice I ever heard Bob Keller use, he said, where are you going? And I said, I don't belong here. And he said, I got a sixth sense today that I know is God. And that sixth sense is telling me that if I let you walk out of here, I'll never see you again, because you'll never make it back. And if you'll let us help you, we can. There's a different way of life here, but you got to let us help you. And I said, okay. Not because I thought he was telling the truth or because I thought I was capable, but because I had no place else in this world to go. And he put me in a place called Chandler Lodge, and after about 3 days of sitting on my hands, because I know that any minute that somewhere along that clock, that thing's going to hit go, and I'm going to go to the store, and I'm going to get some of that Ernest and Julio's pink swill in a bottle, and I'm going to be drunk one more time and living in my car. And my car is all bashed up, and I got no money, but I know it won't matter because I'm going to have to drink. And I went to a noon meeting, and a guy was talking about sponsorship, and he said, you ought to get yourself a sponsor. And I went back to the halfway house, and I started thinking about this guy that I'd seen around the program. And this was the kind of guy who had a different kind of courage. One night, I remember, I'll get to that part in a second. But I called that guy, and his name is Don Morgan, and I called Don, and I said, Don, this is Geoff Kellman, I'm in Chandler Lodge. I had 3 days sobriety, but I wanted him to think I was serious, so I said I had 53 days. And I said, Don, I'm living in Chandler Lodge, and I've got 53 days sobriety, and I was hoping that you would be my sponsor. And I can't tell you exactly what Don said, but if you know Don, you can fill in the blanks. But he said, Geoff, there is no way in the world I would ever be your sponsor. And he kind of stumped me with that one. I didn't have a snappy comeback, and I said, why not? And he said, because you're one of those AA losers, and I see you coming around, and I know you're not serious. And if I was to say yes, I'd spend the next 2 weeks talking about the steps and talking about God and reading the book and introducing you to the people that I look up to. And 2 weeks from now, you'll tell me one more lie, and then you'll disappear, and I will have wasted all that time I could have spent with somebody who really wants this program. And I don't have time for guys like you. And I begged and I cried and I sniveled and finally said, okay, but don't tell anybody I'm your sponsor until I say it's okay. So help me God. And he says, step 1, you are one. Step 2, you better hope so. Step 3 says you made the decision. You just called me. You made the decision. When we see each other, we're going to get down on our knees and we're going to hold hands and we're going to read the 3rd step prayer out loud. We're going to read the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, and when it says to make a decision, we're going to make it. When it says to do something, we're going to do it. And I said, okay. And then he said, do you have some paper? And I said, sure. And he said, here's how I want you to do your inventory. Write this down. And he told me about the fear list, and he told me about columns, and he told me that Wednesday night was inventory night. And his wife went out, his then wife went out every night, every Wednesday night for girls' night, and that was I was supposed to show up at a certain time. I remember the day before, and I didn't have that much written down, like what a surprise. And I called him and I said, you know, maybe this is going to have to happen in God's time. He says, God's time is tomorrow night at 8 o'clock, be at my house. And I get up to Don's house, and in my inventory, I want to talk about going to jail. I want to talk about packing guns. I want to talk about kicking people downstairs. I want to talk about getting locked up and stealing cars and stuff like that and bar fights. And he was unimpressed with all that stuff. You know, he used to leave. We used to sit in this like a bedroom, and he used to leave the TV on, and I'd catch him watching TV, you know, while I was talking and reading. And a couple of times, I'm pretty sure he dozed off, and I'd be trying to tell these tales of daring do and badassery, and he'd just be looking bored, and he'd say, Jesus Christ, Geoff, is there an honest feeling in here anywhere? Is there an emotion in here? Is there any fear, any regret in here? Because I'm not buying any of this. And I push on, and I'd push on, and I'd push on, and then he would stop me in the middle of a paragraph I might be reading, and he would say things that at the time I didn't know what they meant. He would say things like, you know, Geoff, if you look around the world, it's 90% takers and 10% givers. And you come into Alcoholics Anonymous, and lo and behold, it's 90% takers and 10% givers. What side do you want to be on? And even I know the answer to that. I'd say, I want to be a giver, Don. And he'd say, then you've got to have something to give. And there is nothing about you right now that tells me you're ever going to make that stretch. You've got to shake hands with the real Geoff Kelnett. You've got to drop the crap. You've got to get honest. And you've got to wrap your arms around this thing, or you're never going to make it. You're never going to have anything to give away, and you're never going to have any kind of lasting sobriety. And he made me write 5 inventories. God bless his soul. He made me write 5 inventories, and then after 5 inventories, he told me to stand up, and he put his arms around me, and he said, welcome to Alcoholics Anonymous. And he promised me on that day, as we got into step 6 and 7, that everything that was impossible for me as a hope to die wino will become possible through the miracle of Alcoholics Anonymous. And it did. You know, a short time after that, he called me and he said, my favorite speaker is speaking in Venice. And I'm in North Hollywood, and he's way out past Woodland Hills, and he said, pick me up, and we're on our way down there. So I get in my beat-up alcoholic car, and I pick him up, and we drive out to Venice, and we stood in a place outside a building, and I remember there was a vacant lot next door, and the place was so packed, there wasn't even standing room. We had to stand outside in a dirt lot and watch through an open window. And I looked through that window, and for the first time in my life, I saw a guy named Norm Alpe. And I fell in love with Alcoholics Anonymous. I fell in love with that guy's message, and I love him to this day. And we watched him talk that night. I heard June G say one time that watching Norm Alpe talk or listening to Norm Alpe talk made her proud to be a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I know how that feels. And I knew his pitch by heart. You know, we fell in love with that guy. We used to call his wife and find out where he was talking, because he spoke sometimes 14 nights in a month. And he was a tireless worker for Alcoholics Anonymous. And we would, if he was speaking in Costa Mesa, we'd go to Costa Mesa. If he was going to be in Thousand Oaks, we went to Thousand Oaks, and we'd load the car up with new guys, and we'd get there an hour early, hour and a half. We'd help you set up your lousy chairs and make your coffee and steak up, and you wonder who we were. And we knew his pitch by heart, and sometimes we'd chime in, and he'd tell us to shut up, and it was... He was just the best. And there was one thing that he used to say that I'll never forget. You know, he used to talk about being in a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, and a guy's telling his story, and the worse it gets, the more they laugh. And pretty soon he's crippled up, and everybody's left him, and his life's miserable, and he's on Skid Row, and everybody's just laughing their asses off. And then they get to the end, and he finds this miracle of Alcoholics Anonymous, and he gets a second chance, and he gets a new life, and he gets a God. And one by one, his kids come back and learn to love him and respect him. And he talks about being in that meeting. He said, look around that room that night, and they laughed. They laughed because they'd been miserable, and they cried because they were happy, and they called it AA. And that's the greatest description of Alcoholics Anonymous I've ever heard. And I heard that from him 30 years ago, and I never get tired of hearing it. I never get tired of saying it. He was the best. He was the best there ever was. And if you haven't heard him, buy his tapes in the lobby or download them for nothing, whatever you want to do. But he's a guy worth having. And sure enough, you know, just like Don said, my life took off in magical ways, and we went to conventions. And, you know, I remember conventions in those days were like this one. I felt last night like I used to feel back in the late 70s and early 80s. I can remember being at places like the Riviera and at the Sheraton Universal in those days. And they would get these speakers out there like Jack Brennan and Franklin Williams and Talbot Haygood and these giants of sobriety. And they would stand at these podiums in these rooms with thousands of people, and it's such a cliche, but their words would hang in the air like stars. And there would be that point in their talk when they get near the end, when they get really quiet and everybody's feeling the same thing and God's grace fell on every one of us like a blanket. And in that room, 3,000 people all feeling the same thing at the same time. And last night I felt the same way. And it was a remarkable time. I'm not saying it's any different now. I just fell in love with Alcoholics Anonymous. I loved what it did for us, and I loved who we became, and I loved our new friends, and I loved our new life, and I'd never had a feeling like that in my life. And sure enough, all the things that were impossible for me became possible. I got married to the woman that I'd met in Camarillo when I was about a year sober, and then at 2 years sober, we had a little girl. And I got a job working in a place where they don't even let guys like me in the door, and I found that thing that I think maybe I was meant to do. And my life took off, and I had a Cinderella story. And every 3 or 4 years, they'd call me in, and they'd give me a bigger job and a bunch more money. And every 5 or 6 years, I'd go out and buy myself a bigger house. And every 8 years, I got a new Mrs. Calnan. And I did that for a long time until pretty soon, I got a really big job. And, and I've had all those experiences along the way. I went into a meeting one time in Hong Kong. There was 3 people in that meeting, including me. There was a guy from Canada, and some guy wearing a full-length opera coat. And we had to wake him up. He was sleeping on the couch in Hong Kong. And in this little schoolhouse over Victoria Harbor, we had to wake the 3rd guy up to start the meeting, and he opened his eyes, and he said, "I know you." And I said, "No, you don't." And he said, "Sure I do." And I said, "I'd never been to Hong Kong in my life." And he said, we went back and forth like that for a while, and finally he said, "You spoke at the St. James Church in Newport Beach about 6 months ago. Your sponsor's name is Don. I was there." And I had that experience in Wexford Island, and I had it in Hong Kong, I had it in the Virgin Islands, I had it every place I went. And I do want to back up, but, well, maybe I won't, but let's just move on. Okay, and but I got to get to the point. But pretty soon, and I have all the trappings of Alcoholics Anonymous. Like Norm Malpe used to say, I lived on the sunny side of the street. And pretty soon I got this great big job and this great big life and this great big house, and I'm engaged to the future ex-Mrs. Calnan, number 3 or whatever she was going to be. And I got this big job, and I got a lot of responsibilities, and I got 3 kids and a couple ex-wives, and I got cars and boats and motorcycles and homes, and I got this big life in this little bitty program. And I was talking about it with somebody yesterday, and it's like grains of sand. I don't remember making a decision to back out of Alcoholics Anonymous. I don't remember making a decision to live with untreated alcoholism. It was like little tiny grains of sand. As my life got bigger and bigger, I started spending less and less time with you. And if I'm not with you, I'm not with God, because you have always been my connection to God. I wish I could say I was that kind of spiritual being that I can sit in a room by myself and feel God. It ain't that way for me. I get it when I'm with you, or when I just been with you. I might still be experiencing it later, but I get it from you, and that you've always been my source. And I don't think I took a cake for 16, 17, or 18. I know I took a cake for 19 years because a guy that I'd sponsored for 18 years came to town and wanted to give me a cake. And I'm driving up the hill at night to my big house on the hill, and I can remember what guys like Norm Malpe and Eddie Regan and those guys and Larry Blake used to say. And they used to say, if you put anything in front of God in your sobriety, you will lose it. And by the way, if you go back out, it'll be like you never quit. And I could never figure out what kind of weird upside down backwards AA math that was. But I used to think, man, I hope that crap's not true, because tomorrow we're going to New York, and next week I'm going to Mexico. And I got a big deal coming through, and I got this and I got that. And the truth was, I just wasn't even that comfortable in rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous anymore. The only time I ever went to a meeting of AA in those last couple of years is when I was the main speaker, and every time I went, I heard the same crappy pitch, because it was mine, and it was empty, and it got emptier and emptier and emptier, and I know I'm starting to live with fear, and I can look back now and see it plain as day. And the day came when we were out of the country, and I'm with her, and she's the youngest, craziest one yet, and all her friends have heavy foreign accents and no visible means of support, but lots of money, and I don't know what they do for a living, but it's crazy, and we're out of the country in this place, and they're pouring drinks, and I don't remember thinking that I don't love my kids. I don't remember thinking that I didn't love that woman. I don't remember thinking that I wasn't grateful for everything that I had. I don't remember wanting to burn my life to the ground or even thinking about it. But they're pouring drinks, and I said to her, give me one. I was 3 months shy of my 20th birthday. And I said, give me one. And she said, are you sure about that? And I said, you know, I'm not the same guy that I was 20 years ago. Because like little grains of sand, my hourglass had run out. And I didn't have anything left in my spiritual bank account. I had failed to enlarge and perfect my spiritual life, just like the big book says. It's that simple. And I am ashamed to tell you that I picked up that drink and I poured it down, because I didn't put that bottle down for 2.5 years. And that's not why I'm ashamed. I don't love doing this because I don't like telling my story. Because I am ashamed to say that after 20 years of living on the sunny side of the street that I found it necessary to take another drink. Because I just couldn't live with untreated alcoholism anymore. And I don't want to give anybody here the impression that I'm saying that slipping or relapse is a part of Alcoholics Anonymous, because it's got nothing to do with AA. It's a part of my story. It might be a part of alcoholism, but it's got nothing to do with AA. And I picked up that drink and I poured it down, and my first thought was, I got to get some more. And the wheels came off in a really short time and I couldn't tell my sponsor and I couldn't tell my friends, and I'm living with this secret. But that secret's out pretty fast, because in a month's time, I'm rolling down the hill from my big house in my big car, and I'm pulling into the 7-Eleven because I got to get some bottles of mouthwash, because I get some alcohol in me that doesn't smell like alcohol because my hands are shaking so bad. And I start using up obnoxious concoctions of drugs and booze just to get through the day. And pretty soon the wheels start coming off at work, and the wheels start coming off in my relationships, and the wheels start coming off with my kids. And things just spun out of control right away. I was arrested in my own home because I threw my fiance down on the floor, and she called the cops, and they arrested me at gunpoint in my own house. And they were justified in doing so. And I became this animal, and I became this person, and it was just like I never quit. I was worse than I ever was before. And I did things I never thought I'd do. And I thought I couldn't get much lower than I was when I got here the first time, but I found some new stuff. And I lost my house, and I lost my career, and I lost my cars, and I lost my motorcycles, and I lost my friends, and I lost my kids, and I lost her, and I lost my self-respect, and I lost my dignity, and I lost my hope, and I lost all my dreams. And about almost 2.5 years later, I know this is a prevention of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I mean no disrespect, but I got to say something because it's my truth. When I got to Alcoholics Anonymous in 1978, I looked down, even though I'd used some drugs, I looked down my nose at people who used heroin, because I never did that, and that just wasn't ever going to be me. But I'm at 50 years old, and I've been out there for 2.5 years, and I was doing all that stuff. And my life was just a complete mess. I was this, I was everything that Matthew described last night so well. And I was pitiful, and one by one I had burned everybody that ever cared about me, and nobody was coming back around anymore. And I had long since given up that I was ever going to get back to Alcoholics Anonymous. I went to rehabs, I went to your meetings, I fell off your chairs, I broke your hearts, I lied to you, I stole from you, and pretty soon you just couldn't come around. Even my sponsor said, I love you, I'll always love you, but I can't watch you do this anymore. And there was I'm living in this house which I'm about to be evicted out of. I already lost my house, and I got a loaded .45 in my pocket because I'm selling guns to get more money to buy more booze. Mr. High Roller, one day I'm a citizen, and I'm a father, and I'm a fiance, and I'm an employer, and I'm an employee, and I'm a taxpayer, and I'm all those things. And one day I pick up a drink, and the next day I am none of those things. And I'm selling guns to nefarious characters and cocaine dealers, and there was one guy who was too dumb to not come around anymore. He was new. And he didn't know any better. And he was Israeli. I hardly understood a word that he said. And this newcomer who I'd met through another alcoholic would come to my house every day and would say, Geoff, you're welcome to come in, and would tell me that I was welcome back in Alcoholics Anonymous. And one night he was over at this place that I'm getting ready to be evicted out of, and I'm selling this one exotic piece of weaponry to a cocaine dealer. And it's a very important sale, and I was messing with it, and I'd gotten a round jammed in there somehow, and I couldn't get the magazine out. And he's talking to me about A&A, and I pulled the trigger just because I was so loaded. I thought, well, that's going to be a good idea. I'll just see if it's... And then went pop, 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 like that, and one bullet went right next to his foot, and he looked down at that, and he says, I got to go. And then... and he went home, and he called his sponsor. And he said, I'm not going back up there, because whew, I'm either going to get loaded or I'm going to get shot. And neither one of them sounds like a good idea. And his sponsor, who I've never met, said, that's not true, Shahar. He said, haven't you read the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous? It says that you can go to the most sordid place on earth and have no fear as long as your motives are right. And your motives are right. You want to go back up there and help your friend. So what I want you to do is get in your car and drive back over to the San Fernando Valley and go see your friend and tell him that he's welcome back in Alcoholics Anonymous, because that's what it says in the big book to do. By the way, the next line says, your job now is to be on the firing line of life, and homeboy was on the firing line for sure. And so he got back in his car and he drove back over to the valley, and eventually he and another guy took me to see a guy named Buddy Arnold, and I was so past thinking I was ever going to make it back here. And on the day that I had an appointment to see Buddy, you know, Buddy ran a program for musicians, and I'm no musician, and if you ever heard me play guitar, you know that's true. And nobody could take me, so my 19-year-old daughter had to take me down there. My 19-year-old daughter, who never saw her father take a drink until she was 18 years old. And I broke her heart that day, on her 18th birthday. And she drove me down there. And there was blood on my shirt and booze on my breath. And Buddy took one look at me, and I was all shrunk up about that big around and shot out. And Buddy said, you know what, I got to be honest with you, I don't think you're going to make it. I think you're about 2 weeks from dead. But he said, I can't bear the thought of orphaning that little girl. And I blew my chance to go to detox, and he put me in a place called Cry Help for a social detox, which meant they just put you on a bed and leave you there. And they put me up on the 4th floor. And, you know, I got up that day, and I did everything I could get my hands on, and I went to rehab. And I got enough alcohol and drugs in me that I was able to get through that first day. And somewhere in the middle of that night, I woke up. And all the next day, I laid on that bed. You know, I heard somebody say one time that if August the 7th was your first day of sobriety, then probably August the 6th was the worst day of your life. That is not my story. August the 7th was the day I went to rehab, but August the 8th was the worst day of my life. Because I woke up on that day on that bed really early in the morning, and I was so sick. And I don't mean DT sick, and I don't mean dope sick. I mean I was so soul sick. I was so heartbroken because I laid on that bed, and I saw my life the way it really was. And I saw myself the way I really am. And it was the darkest, loneliest, most frightening place I've ever been in my life. And there isn't a man or a woman in this room right now who doesn't know what I'm talking about. And by the way, this is the only room where there's a man or a woman here who knows exactly what I'm talking about.
Sorry to interrupt your viewing. Taper Dave here. Just wanted to take a second to ask you to like and subscribe to my channel. Let me know if you like what you're listening. I've got some very good talks here, and this one's a great one. Just curious, do you think this is better than Zoom? Tell me what you think.
And I saw myself, and there was nothing I could put between my reality and the way I wanted to feel. And I laid there on that bed, and the only prayer I could manage was please. And I laid on that bed, and I cried off and on all day long. And as I'm laying there, I'm so grateful I had that experience, because when I laid there, I think for the first time in my life, no matter how many conventions I'd been to or meetings I'd been to or giants that I'd known or years that I'd had, for the first time in my life, I comprehended the second step of Alcoholics Anonymous. Because it occurred to me as I laid there that if I could find some way where I felt close to this God we were all talking about, this God that you had, this God that lit you up, if I could find some way to feel like I had one hand in his hand, it wouldn't matter if I had a job or I didn't have a job. If my kids came back or they never came back. If I had a house, didn't have a house. Had a car, didn't have a car. I didn't have any of that stuff. All I had was the mess that I'd made out of my life. And I thought maybe if I could find this God, I would feel okay. Maybe then I could smile. Maybe then I could feel whole. Maybe then I could have some kind of contentment or happiness. But I had to find this God you guys were all talking about. And it wasn't always a pretty journey. And I came out of that place after about 25, 26 days, and I moved into this place called, into this sober living house in the valley. And my ex-fiancée, I'd set her up in this business when we were rolling and living together, and now she's a millionaire, and she showed up on my 51st birthday. She could have bought me a car. She could have bought me a house. She bought me a bicycle. And it was a crappy bike, too. You know, we're in the San Fernando Valley in September. It's 104 outside in the valley, and she bought me a beach cruiser. It didn't have any gears. It weighed about 60 pounds and had big handlebars like this. I was riding down Lankershim Boulevard in North Hollywood one day, and it was a really hot day, and I started feeling kind of good. There's a little wind blowing through what's left of my hair, and I I took my T-shirt off and I'm riding down the street and I'm starting to feel kind of good, you know, with my 33 days of sobriety or wherever it was. And then I rode past this big shiny window and I saw myself in the mirror and I went, Jesus Christ! And I had to stop and put my shirt back on. It was terrifying. And I had a plan when I got out of there that I was going to go back to the meetings where you knew me. I was going to go back to the meetings where you guys knew what a monster I'd been in sobriety. And I was going to go back there and I was going to reconnect. And I would get some sort of respect or some kind of feeling from you because you would know that once I'd been serious about this thing. And it didn't work out that way. I didn't get to those meetings. It was too far away because I couldn't get that far on my bike, you know. And so I started going to different meetings and it turned out that it worked just right. There was a guy there who ran the house. He was the worst pool man in the San Fernando Valley and half his pools had black algae in them and he used to pay me $20 a day to scrub the black algae off the sides of these swimming pools. It grew back faster than I could scrape it off, but that's what I did. And he'd give me $20 in a Jamba Juice, and that would be my day's pay. And I sat in that place, and I went to your meetings. And when the basket came by, if I had $1.50 in my pocket, I put $1 in the basket. If I had $1 in my pocket, I put $1 in the basket. It didn't matter. Not because I'm so generous or because I really believe this thing, but because this is all I had, Alcoholics Anonymous. And I came back here, and thank God I found some guys who said, get in the middle of the room and be about the steps and be about this work, and your life will change. And they gave me the same thing that those guys gave Monica. Thank God, because you know what? If I come into these rooms from where I come from, you know, my wife and I were talking about it last night. You can't get here from where we came from. You can't get here. There's just no way. And if I walk into these rooms from where I come from, and all you got is put the plug in the jug, I might as well go home right now and smoke a 45, because I'm never going to make it that way. I'm never going to just don't drink between meetings. I need something powerful. I need a message that's got some depth and some weight, and I need to plug into this God thing, because this disease I got is way bigger than me. And you guys said, God's in these rooms. God's in these steps. Let's work it out. And you showed me where it was. And I started all over again. And every once in a while, I'd kind of lose myself, and I'd start thinking I know something, because I was sober once for a long time. And I'd start to offer an opinion about something, and the guys would stop over at the Spirit of Studio 12, and the guy would go, didn't you drink after almost 20 years? And I'd say, well, yeah. And he goes, shut up. And then they go back to... One guy offered me to be treasurer of this one meeting, of this men's stag meeting, and the other guy jumped up and said, somebody make sure that sumbitch has a job. And I didn't get any respect, and I rode my crappy bike to your crappy meetings, and I started to find my God. And you know, and sure enough, I think I had this big morality tale that I let my life get so big and my job get so big that it overtook my sobriety. And sure enough, and by the way, at about 6 months, when I was in that sober living house, there was one woman who was really kind to me. And she was a friend. And she took me to meetings, and she asked me how I was doing. And 6 months later, you know, I moved out of that place, and I got a little place, and she called me because she needed some help. And we talked, and the day she decided that she was going to get clean and sober and she was going to change her life, her drug dealer decided it wasn't a good day for that. And make a long story short, she managed to escape, and he was calling her, and there was death threats, and it was just a lot of craziness. And I called all my, and this guy was in her apartment, and she was at my house, and she's calling me, and I finally got a little job, and I don't know what to do, so I get off work. And I'm calling all my AA badass outlaw friends, you know, and nobody's available to go down to this girl's apartment to get her cat and get her stuff, and she's terrified and she's upset, and so I want you to know that I've read the big book from cover to cover about I don't know how many times. So I do it every Sunday night with a group of guys. It doesn't say anywhere in that book that you can't take a gun on a 12-step call. I don't recommend it, but we loaded up Mr. 45, and we went down there, and we got her stupid cat and got her clothes, and she didn't have any place else to go. And I'm not saying it's right, I'm not saying it's wrong, but next month we'll be married 7 years, and I love you, sweetheart. And we started out in this life. I got to jump ahead, and then I'll jump back. But you know, we started out in this life, and we had nothing. And in fact, when we were going to get married at about 2 years sober, I went to see an accountant guy, because when I got sober, I owed the government about $100,000, and I lost another lawsuit. I owed somebody else about $40,000, and I had a lot of legal problems and financial problems. And I went to see this guy, and I came back, and I said, honey, I'm going to have to go bankrupt just to do this, to get this whole tax thing organized and start paying them back. And if you don't want to do this, I understand. If you want to stay clear for a while, I understand. And she said, we got to, whatever comes down the pike, we're going to solve it together. And you're my best friend, the best thing that ever happened to me after Alcoholics Anonymous, and I love you. And when she was sober a few years, she decided she wanted to be a psychologist, and now she's got a PhD. And the miracles just keep coming. But anyway, I got to jump back. So at 2 years sober, I get another job, kind of like what I used to do, and I think I'm finally going to get back, and I'm finally going to be on top, and I'm going to make it one more time. And now pretty soon that becomes all I can think about, and I got to get back up on top. And I worked in this place for a few months, and I was going to clean up Dodge and make everything bitchin'. And I'm still picking up new guys, but I'm still really starting to get invested in this whole job thing again. And one day the chairman calls me and says, be in my office Monday morning at 8 o'clock. And I got to his office at 8 o'clock on Monday morning, and I'm wearing a nice suit, and I walked in there, and I was fired and out of there by about 8:06. And I had plenty of time to make a 9 a.m. meeting. And that night, I'm sitting in a group that at that time was my home group. It's the Chapter 12 Men's Stag in Sherman Oaks, California. And they meet every Monday night at 7:30. And you can't raise your hand in that meeting. And there's 110 guys in that room every night. Every chair is taken. And there's guys there that played golf at the same country club. And there's guys there that both did time in the shoe at Pelican Bay. And they mix up in the weirdest of ways. When you haven't really lived until you've seen the studio executive hear the inventory of Big Spanky from White Fence. It's a unique experience, and it happens in that meeting every Monday night. And I'm sitting in that meeting, and I'm wondering, where's mine? When is this going to happen for me? Because when I got back here and I told you about all the stuff that I lost, and by the way, I forgot that one important thing. When I first came back here, I had so many remarkable gifts. I met a guy named Tommy when I was just a few months sober, and Tommy was talking to another guy. He wasn't even talking to me, and I heard this guy say, I think I'll be measured today by what I do and not by what I say. And that haunted me. And you know what? For 8.5 years, I haven't raised my hand in a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I don't think anybody ever missed that. But what happened was I heard some remarkable things. Because, when I was just about a month sober, there was that guy, Matthew, came to speak at the sober living house where I was living, where I was destitute. And he told his story. And that night he said, I don't know what's good for me. And those words went through me like a rifle shot. And I knew that message was for me. I didn't know why it was important, but I knew it was important. I heard an Al-Anon lady say one night that the measure of my hopelessness, the measure of my fear, the measure of my anxiety is equal to my distance from God. I heard Matthew's sponsor, Bill Cleveland, say that God lives in the spaces between me and you. And if I want to get close to God, I got to get close to you. And the closer I get to you, the closer I get to God. I met Bob Olson, who told me that the fellowship of the Spirit is the common experience that grows up around people who share the common experience of working the 12 steps. It's not about the dance. It's not about the coffee shop. It's not even about the meetings. It's about working the steps and being in each other's lives. And so I know all this stuff. But at 2 years sober, the other thing you told me when I was new was that, oh, you'll get all that stuff back. Guess what, newcomers? We don't know. It's just some stuff that we say. And I'm sitting in that meeting, and I'm wondering if you lied to me about that, because where's mine? And that night, there was a guy in our group, and his name was Joey. And Joey's son had been hurt a few months before in a football accident. He was 14 years old. And before they could get Nicky to the hospital, he was in a coma. And Nicky laid in that coma for 4.5 months. And he almost died 6 times. And the first person Joey called when that happened was his sponsor, Dave. And Dave called some guys, who called some gals, who called some more guys. And by 9:30 that night, the hospital was full of people from Alcoholics Anonymous. And there wasn't a sign-up sheet or a committee or anything like that, but there was always somebody there from Alcoholics Anonymous. And we used to call on Joe on Monday nights, because you can't raise your hand there, but we called on Joe because he got so many phone calls from so many members of Alcoholics Anonymous in places that he's never been, people that he's never known. People would call him and say, hey, we're praying for you and your son. And he couldn't possibly return them all. So we'd get him up to the front of that room so he could tell us what was happening with Nicky. And this one night he's telling us about Nicky, and he's never going to walk, and he's never going to talk, and we hope he lives, and he's going on and on. And then he stops in the middle of that thing, and he looks out at this one guy, and he says, I got to thank Biff. Because I didn't know Biff before this happened. He was just another guy I saw at the meetings. But Biff has been there every day. And I don't know what I would have done without you, Biff. And I love you. And my family loves you. And I saw in those two guys the person that I always wanted to be. I saw in what they meant to each other. the feeling I always wanted to have. And I saw in that thing that they did, that took both of them, that God that I've been looking for this whole time. And I set out trying to be more like Joe and more like Biff. And I started, like I said, there's all this strange configuration of people in this meeting, people who ordinarily would not mix. I never get, the rock and rollers or the captains of industry or the studio executives never ask me to be their sponsor. I get Brain Damage Larry, Scary Jimmy, On-Ramp Rich, Armenian Hike, and Scary Jimmy was like a guy, this guy Jimmy, he's so big, and I think all his shirts are about 5 sizes too small, and he's got a back you could park a Ford on, and he's got a shaved head, and he had about 3 teeth, and these gigantic arms bigger than my head, and he's just huge, and this little bit, he looks like Brutus, from Popeye, and one time he's in my car, and he goes, I think people look at me and judge me, and I said, Jesus, Holmes, look in the mirror, you're scary, and he's a great guy, and I never know when that phone's going to ring. One day the phone rings on a Saturday, and it's Billy the convict, and he says, "Hey, I got a guy. He's at PIP. He just got out of Pelican Bay. He's perfect for you," and I don't know why he's perfect for me. And I get dressed, and I'm starting to leave, and Laura says, "Where are you going?" And I said, "I'm going to PIP," and she's like, "What's with you and the convicts?" And the guy at work calls me, my assistant, guy used to be my assistant, called me the convict whisperer. And this guy was amazing. His name's Jack. He's from Ohio State. He's got a buzz cut, and he's really earnest, and he was my assistant. And one time I got a call from a guy, and he said, "Hey, listen, you got a call," but the guy didn't leave a message. And I said, "You don't know who it was?" And he goes, "No, but I'm pretty sure it was one of your AA friends." And I said, "How do you know?" And he said, "Because he called me Holmes." So I go over to PIP, and this is where the story gets good for me. I go to PIP, and I ask for this guy named Phil, and they said, he's in the day room, and that's all they said. And I went in the day room, and he was easy to spot because he was sitting all by himself. And he's in the middle of the room watching TV, and he's got a widow's peak tattooed on his forehead, and this white, wife beater undershirt, and a big black swastika sticking out under one side of it, and "Love Thy Race" on the back of his neck, and he just looks pissed off. And I go and I sit down with him, and I give him the AA interview, and I ask him if he's ever been to a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, and he said no. And I said, "Not even in the penitentiary?" And he said, "I couldn't." And I said, "That's weird, dude, because I go up to CMC a lot, and there's guys there doing life, and they go every Friday night." And he said, "Not in the SHU, you can't go." And if you don't know, the SHU is solitary confinement. And I said, "You were in the SHU? And how long?" And he said, 2.5 years. And yeah, he impressed me with that one. I said, "You must be about a serious dude." And he leaned over the table and assured me that he was, and he told me his story, and you know what? He should have been in there for 2.5 years. And in that place, he's scary. Out here he can be kind of scary, but in that place, he's a shot caller, and he's got horsepower, and he's a force to be reckoned with and somebody to be afraid of. But out here, he's just another one of God's kids trying to make it. And so I did him like my sponsor did me, and I said, "Look, I don't know about any of that stuff, but I can tell you that if I'm going to be your sponsor, we're going to read the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. And when it tells us to make a decision, we're going to make it. When it tells us to do something, we're going to do it. And the minute you don't do that, I'm not your sponsor, and I'm going to ask you to do stuff, and you're going to think it's lame or it's stupid or it's gay, and I don't really care. You're going to do it, or I'm not your sponsor." And he said, "I just don't want to go back to prison. So I guess I'm willing to do that." And there are some rooms where that's not a good enough answer. I called Bob Olson, and he said, "How do you know? How do you know what the right answer is?" Because I know that Matthew's sponsor, Bill Cleveland, says when the phone rings, it's God trying to get in touch with you because one of his kids needs help. And so I sponsored Phil. And I tried to tell him up front what we were going to do, but the day came when we were going to go do his third step, and I think I forgot to tell him that we were going to get down. He didn't believe in God, and I forgot to tell him that we were going to get down on our knees and hold hands and read the prayer. And so I picked him up, and I'm waiting for just the right moment to tell Nazi lowrider Phil what we're going to do, and the moment never came. And we got to the church, and he said, "What are we doing?" And I told him, and he got a kind of a funny smile, and I said, "I know you don't believe in God, but how do you feel about prayer?" And he said, I told you when we started this, I'd be willing to do that. I'd be willing to do anything, so I guess I'm willing to do that. And we went in that place, and we knelt down, and we held hands, and he read that prayer. And Phil got a new God that day, and he got a new life, and I got a new friend. And a year later, he called me on December the 17th and said, Spons, I got a year today, and tomorrow I'm going to go to Tennessee because I haven't seen my mother in 14 years. And she moved there some years ago when I was in prison, and I'm scared. And we talked about it, and I told him that God was going to go with him, and that I'd call him on that day, and he got there, and on Christmas Day, I went in our backyard, and I called Phil. And I said, how's it going? And he said, well, it's a little dicey with Mom. It's, there's a lot of water under the bridge, but it's okay. And he said, hold on, she wants to talk to you. And his mom got on the phone, and we made small talk about it being Christmas and about the weather in Tennessee. And then she said, I waited 14 years for this day, and this is the greatest Christmas present I ever could have had. And I want to thank you and your friends for what you did for my son, Phil. Alcoholics Anonymous. That's Alcoholics Anonymous. We did that. It's the only place in the world where I know that happens. And on that day, when she said those words to me, I knew a little bit about how Biff and Joey felt. I knew what they meant to each other. I knew what it meant to really feel like I was a cog in God's wheel, like I was a part of God's perfect plan. I don't remember what a spiritual experience used to feel like, or if I even had them in those first 19 and whatever years. I know what they feel like today, because sometimes I'm driving along. I might be driving by myself. I might be someplace with Laura. I might be watching my kid. I might be coming back from shooting guns. I might be anywhere. Or I might be in a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. More than likely, I just came back from a panel where suddenly, because when I'm with you, it seems like a good idea to drive 4 hours to San Luis Obispo to talk at a prison for 5 minutes and then drive 4 hours home. Because, by the way, that's the best out meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous I've ever been to, is in CMC East with the lifers. And but it's usually that feeling, and I get that feeling that comes up inside of me sometimes, and it wells up. And I can remember every happiness and every heartache I've ever had, good and bad, all at the same time. And I am filled to overflowing with experience and gratitude and love. And I look at my life, and I look at the world around me, and I know that everything is in perfect order. And I know that everything's okay. And I know that every one of us is a child of God and God's own perfect plan. And I feel that way, and I think sometimes I just feel so good that the tears start running down my face. It might last for a few seconds. It might last for an hour. One time it lasted for a whole day. I thought I was losing my goddamn mind. And I think maybe, it's just a theory, because God, I don't know what God thinks, but I think that maybe that's just a little bit of how God feels when he sees us together, when he sees what we do for each other. There's a million things I could talk about. I didn't come here today to say that I'm great. I came to say that Alcoholics Anonymous is great. I came to say that you're great. I came to say that God is great. I love Ralph White. I'm going to be on a panel or on a speaking a thing with Ralph White in next month, and we're going to be in Holland. And this is, Ralph's one of those great AA speakers, and when it gets to this part of the pitch, he gets really quiet, and his voice gets really soft. And he always goes, shh. You hear that? That's God. And he's telling us as long as we have each other, everything's going to be okay, and all things are possible. God bless you. Thank you for having me.
I think we got a great talk going on here. Thanks for watching the channel. Taper Dave here. Just curious, do you think this is better than Zoom? Okay, this is how I prepare my drone for launching. I like to do it inside the cab of my truck so I'm not standing outside in the weather. To install the joysticks for control, up and down, right and left, powered on. I have an Android phone that I use to connect it to the drone with, and it's actually controlled through the iPhone through an app. Oops. Wrong way. It's actually controlled through the iPhone, or through this Android phone, through the app. It's actually controlled through the Android phone through an app, and you connect it through this short connection right here.
Remote control connected.
Remote control's connected. So I pull out the drone. I have to extend the legs. Long legs extended first, then the short legs. Remove the gimbal protector. Set that aside, then power it on one short burst, then one long burst. I lay it down. So I have to go to calibrate. So the drone's not connected yet. It shows you here as this drone gets disconnected, even though the remote's powered on. So the drone has to establish it's connected. So I go into the app to calibration mode. First I'll calibrate the remote controller. Start calibration. Out, in, out, in, up, down, and then this little wheel is to control the gimbal. So it's calibrated. Go to gimbal calibration, start calibration, and then it calibrates the gimbal. If that shows up, the gimbal's moving all over the place. Changes, you can see it on the video. And I'm calibrated to take off. It's acquired 7 satellites at the moment. There are 26 satellites up in the sky, which it has to acquire before you can take off. So it's connected. It's got enough satellites. This is white. I can go to press this little arrow button, swipe right to take off, and it would start the motors if I slid this to the right, but I'll wait till I get outside. Don't want to do it inside.